Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 26 talking about World War I. This is about Section 2, a new kind of war. So find your packets and follow along. Here we go. Number 1, the term no man's land comes from the dangerous open areas between the trenches. No man's land at times could be very muddy and very dangerous for our soldiers. Trenches, originally they probably started off with just little low sunken in areas, but as the war progresses, the trenches become incredibly fortified and very sophisticated as far as the works and the connectiveness of these different trench systems on both the Allied side and the Central Powers side. So as a result of the stalemate in the trenches, new technology was developed. You saw the introduction of gas warfare. Poisonous gases had a tendency to sink to the lowest point, hence they would sink right into those trenches. And in many cases, soldiers who were exposed to it were either blinded. Some of the gases that were developed actually attacked the lungs, and so if a soldier breathed in the poisonous gases, they would cough to the point where they would basically be coughing up blood and chunks of their lungs. Tanks were also developed during this war. Many of the tanks were not necessarily all that big. Many of them were just fortified to a point where they could travel through the mud and muck. But in cases of being fired upon, the armor was very, very thin. And in some cases, the bullets would penetrate the armor on these tanks and literally ricochet around, hitting the victims on the inside of the tank. A lot of times people talked about tanks being kind of like rolling coffins. And then aircraft. Aircraft was kind of in its infancy, but originally it was kind of being used for surveillance. In time, people found out that, you're up there at a high altitude, you might be able to drop a bomb or two. In time, the aircraft would eventually be equipped with guns, and a lot of times the open cockpit would have a pilot and a gunner. One of the things that came out of this boom for technology for aircraft is that the propeller blades, like you see right here, eventually a timing mechanism would be developed so a gunner could actually fire forward and wouldn't have to worry about hitting the front of their propeller. And what would happen is the bullet would fire in between the blades for the most part. Other developments, we had blimps or zeppelins. Blimps, for the most part, had been around for a number of years. Matter of fact, there was a use of balloons in warfare dating back before the American Civil War. But when we talk about the German zeppelins or the blimps that the Allies had, many of these were rigid, meaning that they usually had some kind of internal skeleton that can make them very, very large. And some of them were used, again, obviously, for surveillance, but in time there were some bombing campaigns. Matter of fact, the city of London was bombed during a Zeppelin bombing campaign. Along with that, submarines. This isn't the first war that submarines were used. You could go back and talk about the USS Hunley during the American Civil War, but submarines on a large scale became very lethal weapons, especially the German U-boats, which basically is their equivalent of a submarine. Because of gas warfare, we had to have the development of gas masks, not only for our soldiers, but even for the horses that were there. Machine guns, there were Gatling guns kind of prior to 1900, but by the time we get to the First World War, the guns are becoming a little bit more sophisticated, especially the fact that in some cases in combat, machine gunners would just lay on the trigger for a period of time and they might burn out the barrel. It was basically a design change where you would actually cool the barrel by putting water through it, kind of like you would do a coil for air conditioning. So our machine guns could last longer. Howitzers, which are basically big artillery pieces, using secret coded messages, also being used during this war. So a lot of new technological improvements came about during this First World War, kind of as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Propaganda and censorship were used during the war because it could unify people to support the war effort, but it also kept people from knowing the true extent of what was happening. Not only did you see propaganda through parts of Europe, but eventually when the United States enters the war in 1917, propaganda and censorship is going to be used even in the United States. Let's talk about the battles. When we talk about World War I, a lot of times we talk about battles that happen on the Eastern Front, where I'm moving my cursor, or you might hear about battles that occur on the Western Front, which would basically be battles that were happening in parts of Belgium or France. And so in the Western Front, France and Germany both suffered enormous casualties, particularly the Battle of Verdun, which was primarily a battle between French forces and German forces. The French, for the most part, lost relatively close to 400,000 soldiers, and the Germans, they were pretty close to having the same amount of soldiers that were injured. About a year later, we had the Battle of Somme, which is along a river, kind of closer to Paris. But during this battle, this is the battle that the British actually initiated, and it really took up a good portion of that whole year's worth of fighting. This battle began in June of 1916, and on one particular day, the first day alone of fighting, the British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. You compare that to America's bloodiest day, which was the Battle of Antietam, where we're talking just, maybe 12,000 casualties in the day. So, the British really suffered in this conquest here. The Germans were defeated by the British in the Battle of the Third Battle of the Ypres, and the front line, for the most part, remained unchanged. Okay, for the most part, when World War I begins in 1914, we have a very lush, very agrarian agricultural landscape. And as the battles, just kind of get to the point where it's kind of a stalemate or a battle of attrition, a lot of that landscape is pulverized. And what was lush green, fertile land becomes muddy, lunar-like landscapes, which is really unfortunate. Number 5, World War I was truly a world war because over 30 nations officially took sides in the war and fought on continents like Europe, Asia, the Pacific, and also in Africa. The war's stalemate influenced warring nations because they had to look elsewhere for ways to win this war. The special defensive position controlled by the Ottoman Empire was called the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles is kind of I guess you could call it a waterway. It's a strait of water that separates basically two larger bodies. So if you're looking at it maybe in the much larger scope of like the Mediterranean from that of the Black Sea. And the goal here was to control that area and to maybe cut the power of the Central Powers. And so the British, and the British in this case would mean soldiers from the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. They go to a place called Gallipoli, which is a peninsula here that's basically kind of right off what would be present-day Turkey, kind of on the European continent side of it. And what ends up happening is we have one of the most bloodiest battles in the First World War. The Gallipoli campaign basically in the spring of 1915, just went on, and roughly nearly 200,000 casualties were suffered before the Allies decided to give up. You know, the thing about this battle is that the Ottoman controlled the high ground, and our British, or British subjects here, literally were on the coast. And it didn't take much for the Ottoman to have the upper hand here. They could just roll stones off the cliffs here and inflict a lot of damage, let alone fire down upon these sitting ducks, if you want to call them that. I mentioned before that London and other cities had suffered aerial bombings. And not only London, but we could also talk about German cities as well. So this war certainly was a very, very bloody conflict. One thing that I did not have you write down was some information about the Armenian massacre or Armenian genocide, which was perpetrated by the Ottoman, whereas a group of Armenians who were, some of them were Christian. You got to remember, our Ottoman are predominantly Muslim, were literally starved to death, and some 600,000 Armenians perished during this genocide. Thank you very much.